apparently contemptible seems to be dropped. Whereas the people of Lilliput have behaved towards Gulliver with the utmost treachery and meanness, those of Blefuscu behave generously and straightforwardly. And indeed, this section of the book ends on a different note from the all-round disillusionment of the earlier chapters. Evidently, Swift's animus is, in the first place, against England. It is, quote, "your natives," i.e. Gulliver's fellow countrymen, whom the king Bodrenong considers to be, quote, "the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." And the long passage at the end, denouncing colonization and foreign conquest, is plainly aimed at England, although the contrary is elaborately stated. The Dutch, England's allies and target of one of Swift's most famous pamphlets, are also more or less wantonly attacked in Part 3. There is even what sounds like a personal note in the passage, in which Gulliver records his satisfaction that the various countries he has discovered cannot be made colonies of the British Crown. The Houyhnhnms, indeed, quote, "the Houyhnhnms indeed appear not to be so well prepared for war, a science to which they are perfect strangers, and especially against missive weapons. However, supposing myself to be a minister of state, I could never give my advice for invading them. Imagine 20,000 of them breaking into the midst of a European army, confounding the ranks, overturning the carriages, battering the warriors' faces into mummy, by terrible yerks from their hinterhoofs," unquote. Considering that Swift does not waste words, that phrase, quote, "battering the warriors' faces into mummy," unquote, probably indicates a secret wish to see the invincible armies of the Duke of Marlborough treated in a like manner. There are similar touches everywhere. There are similar touches elsewhere. Even the country mentioned in Part 3, where, quote, "the bulk of the people consist, in a manner, wholly of discoverers, witnesses, informers, accusers, prosecutors, evidences, swearers, together with their several subservient and subaltern instruments, are all under the colors, the conduct, and pay of ministers of state," unquote, is called Langdon, which is within one letter of being an anagram of England. As the early editions of the book contain misprints, it may perhaps have been intended as a complete anagram. Swift's physical repulsion from humanity is certainly real enough, but one has the feeling of his debunking of human grandeur, his diatribes against lords, politicians, court favorites, etc., has mainly a local application and springs from the fact that he belonged to the unsuccessful party. He denounces injustice and oppression, but he gives no evidence of liking democracy. In spite of his enormously greater powers, his implied position is very similar to that of the innumerable silly, clever conservatives of our own day, people like Sir Alan Herbert, Professor G.M. Young, Lord Elton, and the Tory Reform Committee, or the long line of Catholic apologists from W.H. Mallock onwards. People who specialize in cracking neat jokes at the expense of whatever is modern or progressive, and whose opinions are often all the more extreme because they know that they cannot influence the actual drift of events. After all, such a pamphlet as an argument to prove that the abolishing of Christianity, etc., is very like Timothy Sly, quote unquote, having a bit of clean fun with the Brains Trust, or Father Ronald Knox exposing the errors of Bertrand Russell. And the ease with which Swift has been forgiven sometimes by devout believers for the blasphemies of A Tale of a Tub demonstrates clearly enough the feebleness of religious sentiments as compared with political ones. However, the reactionary cast of Swift's mind does not show itself chiefly in his political affiliations. The important thing is his attitude towards science, and more broadly, towards intellectual curiosity. The famous Academy of Legato, described in Part 3 of Gulliver's Travels, is no doubt a justified satire on most of the so-called scientists of Swift's own day. Significantly, the people at work in it are described as projectors, quote-unquote. That is, people not engaged with interested research, engaged in disinterested research, but merely on the lookout for gadgets which will save labor and bring in money. But there is no sign.
In 1 mile, exit right.
But there is no sign. Indeed, all through the book, there are many signs to the contrary that pure science would have struck Swift as a worthwhile activity. The more serious kind of scientist has already had a kick in the pants in part 2, when scholars, quote-unquote, patronized by the king of Brobdingnag, try to account for Gulliver's small stature. Quote, after much debate, they concluded unanimously that I was only relplum scalicath, which is interpreted literally lusus naturae, a determination exactly agreeable to the modern philosophy of Europe, whose professors, disdaining the old evasion of occult causes, whereby the followers of Aristotle endeavored in vain to disguise their ignorance, have invented this wonderful solution of all difficulties to the unspeakable advancement of human knowledge. If this stood, unquote, if this stood by itself, one might assume that Swift is merely the enemy of sham science. In a number of places, however, he goes out of his way to proclaim the uselessness of all learning or speculation not directed towards some practical end. Quote, the learning of the Brobdingnagians is very defective, consisting only in morality, history, poetry, and mathematics, wherein they must be allowed to excel. But the last of these is wholly applied to what may be useful in life, to the improvement of agriculture and the medical arts, so that among us it would be little esteemed. And as to ideas, entities, abstractions, and transcendentals, I could never drive the least conception into their heads. Unquote. The Hunhems, Swift's ideal beings, are backward even in a mechanical sense. They are unacquainted with metals, have never heard of boats, do not, properly speaking, practice agriculture. We are told that the oats they live on, quote, grow naturally, unquote, and appear not to have invented wheels. They have no alphabet, and evidently have not much curiosity about the physical world. They do not believe that any inhabited country exists beyond their own, and though they understand the motions of the moon and the sun, and the nature of eclipses, quote, this is the utmost progress of their astronomy. By contrast, the philosophers of the flying island of Laputa are so continuously absorbed in mathematical speculations that before speaking to them, one has to attract their attention by flapping them on the ear with a bladder. They have continued 10,000 years. They've cataloged 10,000 fixed stars, discovered in advance of the astronomers of Europe that Mars has 2 moons, all of which information Swift evidently regards as ridiculous, useless, and uninteresting. As one might expect, he believes that the scientist's place, if he has a place, is in the laboratory, and that scientific knowledge has no bearing on political matters.